Okay, I'd like to introduce the first plenary and also introduce the keynote speaker. Christine Luckasavitch is a woman of the Madawaska River Algonquin people belonging to the Crane clan and mixed settler heritage. Christine continues to live in her ancestral territory, much of which is known now as the Algonquin Park in Ontario. She's the owner and executive consultant of Wasaya Cultural Tours. Also, these are two small businesses dedicated to reviving and celebrating Indigenous ancestral knowledge and cultural-based practices through educational opportunities. In addition to her own companies, she is the executive director of Native Land Digital, an Indigenous-led not-for-profit dedicated to providing education about Indigenous peoples, territories, and knowledge systems across the world. She's currently studying for her Master's of Arts in Indigenous Studies at Trent University. So I'll turn over to Christine to give her presentation.
Wrong one. Right there. Here today to talk a little bit about inclusive cartography and practice. Miigwech for the invitation to share this space with folks who also my name is Christine. I belong to the Crane clan. I am a Madawaska Algonquin woman still living in my ancestral territory. As Marguerite had mentioned, I have two small businesses, Wasaya Consulting and Wasaya Cultural Tours. One is the consulting side, so a little bit more focused on this sort of work, whereas the cultural tour side of things is a little bit more involved in tourism, making sure that visitors to the place that I call home know that it is Indigenous territory. I'm also the co-owner of an Indigenous and woman-led motorcycle clothing company called Algonquin Motors. And actually just recently left my position with Native Land as the executive director so that I could focus on my own dreams. My work centers around making space for Indigenous voices and celebrating Indigenous brilliance. And I do want to say Miigwech to Marguerite for her kindness and organization over the past number of months getting ready for this. And Marguerite, I wish that you were here today. I do want to mention that anything that I share with you today, this comes from my perspective as an Anishinaabe and mixed settler. Welcome to take any questions following the session. I've spent the last 2 days hiking in what is now known as the Anza-Borrego Desert State Park with my childhood friend Alyssa Barty, a Cayuga photographer who's here with me today. So many of the photos, such as this one, it is her work, her brilliance. And I told her the other day as we were hiking, it's really amazing to see her work and how she actually makes those experiences even more beautiful than seeing them firsthand. And give her a follow on Instagram. She's pretty brilliant. So here we go. So the land now known as California is a spectacular part of the world. But what stories does this land hold? No matter where you go, you have a responsibility to know whose territory you're on. You have a responsibility to be in good relationship to this place and to all beings, human and more than human beings who call this place home, particularly those Indigenous to this place. I am a guest here. We are on Serrano and Cahuilla territories. As a guest here, I will act with respect for Indigenous peoples and all more than human beings who have called this place home since time immemorial including ancestors and all future generations. So how do we honor this place that remains Indigenous territories, though it is now also known by other names? How are you honoring Indigenous places and people right now when you're here, but then also when you go home, and in particular through your cartographic practice? This is the very first map I fell in love with. This is home. This is Algonquin Park. It is an iconic Canadian provincial park that is centered around canoe tripping and camping. Gets about 1 million visitors a year through a 54-kilometer stretch of territory. And this is the place that I call home. I live just in like the little corner on what we call the Panhandle. But this map itself, this is a canoe routes map of Algonquin Park. This is also Anishinaabe-Aki, Anishinaabeg land, Anishinaabeg territory. The canoe routes marked on this map, including the portages, they are our original routes. They are our original highways, our travel routes, the places that we called home, and the campsites that people love so much, particularly those beautiful sandy campsites that get full sun during the day. They're the places that we lived, the places that my ancestors lived until 1893, when we were forcibly removed for the creation of this wilderness space. But our stories remain here with this land. But those imaginary boundaries that were put up throughout our territory, they don't include us. These built infrastructures like highways aren't representative of our relationships with this land. But I know this place. I've spent my entire life here. I live within eyesight of the borders of this place where my grandmother was born in 1935. I've spent my entire life here and reconnecting and getting to relearn and reestablish those connections between myself and those more than human beings that have been in place since time immemorial, or as the archaeological record likes to say, at least 12,000 years with the retreat of the Laurentide glacial sheet. But this knowledge in my ancestral territory, it's not represented in this map. But why not? So as I had mentioned, I have been in the position as the executive director of Native Land, so native-land.ca, which is generally kind of the go-to if you're going to do a land acknowledgement or find out whose territory that you're on. This map is purposely flipped upside down to kind of decenter ourselves as North America, because quite honestly, in North America, we think we are the center of the world. Maps are often used as colonial tools with those imaginary lines drawn across landscapes, but these are not representative of Indigenous understandings and knowledge of land. We do not have those hard lines. We overlap. These overlaps show our relationships with place, our relationships with each other, the way that our languages cross over these borders. It also represents the places that we right now in this present form, as well as our ancestors have been in the past, we're taking care of this land for those next 7 generations. So to speak a little bit about Native Land, I will say it was a very incredible position to hold for a number of years, particularly during the pandemic when I was at home. So this is one of the very first in-person sessions that I've been able to be a part of. So thank you for sharing this space with me. Native Land is made up of an all-Indigenous team of remarkable Indigenous people from around the world. It is global, it is completely open source, and most importantly, it is community-based. The knowledges that are represented in this place are put there with community. It is the ways that these communities want to be represented. Oftentimes, at least the starting point for including these places, it is sourced from historical materials, and then any feedback that we get, we tweak it. We tweak it to make sure that it is representative of the people and places that are on this map. You will also notice that there's a lot of, I will say this is a bit of an older screenshot, and it's changed a little bit. Native Land changes every day. We add more territories and representations of peoples based on the feedback we get and the representations. And happy to say that as I was stepping away from my position of executive director, we were working with folks in Africa, the people who know the place, to be able to accurately represent them and their relationships with land. This is a map of Indigenous knowledges represented through a colorful tapestry of those overlapping territories. But it is a tool and a starting point for you to do your homework, for you to know whose land you're on. So you can locate yourself, go on, click the links and go deeper down, kind of the wormhole to learn whose land you're on. And I will say it is still a work in progress with community. So if you have any feedback, please get in touch with folks at Native Land. But from my two plus years at Native Land, if there's any lesson that I could give you, it is that you have to do your homework to learn whose land you're on. You have responsibilities when you're on these territories to be in good relation with all humans and all more than human beings, the seen and the unseen. Everywhere you go, you are on Indigenous lands. And every single one of us, we are Indigenous to somewhere, but we've forgotten that a lot of the time. So inclusive cartographies, what can they look like? For me, the focus is, as I had mentioned, as an Anishinaabe, as an Anishinaabe woman, and my perspective from that place. I focus on, those Indigenous understandings of land represented in maps, and maps are beautiful. There are so many incredible Indigenous cartographers and Indigenous folks working in and around the cartography world. Not a cartographer myself, but rather someone who supports the incredible work that cartographers do. It was an honor to work with folks. And of course, I have to give a shout out to people who fundamentally changed the way that I understand the world, including Margaret Pierce, Mocha Apathy, and Steve DeRoy. To Indigenous cartographers, Chi-miigwech for telling our stories in some of the most beautiful ways possible. Well, as I mentioned too, if you're interested in Indigenous cartographies, check out the Indigenous Mapping Workshop that is hosted by the Firelight Group at the end of November. And I'm going to focus on the work of a friend of mine, a friend and a collaborator, and really look at what inclusive cartography looks like in practice. This is an experience of mine close to home that is based in both partnership and friendship. Chris Brackley, cartographer with As the Crow Flies Cartography and also with Canadian Geographic. This particular, and I apologize if I get emotional because there's a good chance I could, but this particular photo was taken this past June at Camp Pathfinder in Algonquin Park. Camp Pathfinder in Algonquin Park is a boys canoe tripping camp and really just a place where magic happens, where you can see. I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine, her son, went to Camp Pathfinder for the first time this year. And in coming home, he brushed his teeth without being asked. He helped to set the table without being asked. Because of this 11-year-old boy had a fundamental shift in who he was, and he grew up, but also had this incredible pride in being able to canoe trip and not being scared of jumping in the water. So Camp Pathfinder is a place that is near and dear to my heart, particularly in the sense that we are changing the ways in which, oh geez, 1 minute, come on, really? Okay, I'm gonna keep going a little bit quicker. So this is a massive floor map. This massive floor map is an Indigenous cartography, so it actually shows, so I'm gonna kind of go really quick with this. This is a close-up. It shows treaties, place names, locations, hunting territories, names, travel routes, etc., but it's a floor map. It shows Indigenous understandings, but it's created by a non-Indigenous cartographer, and what a beautiful partnership that is. But in this photo here, Chris told a story about how he, as a tripper at Camp Pathfinder, how he went from just being on the land and being a canoe tripper into completely shifting his understanding and the role that he can play as a cartographer. So let's go back to this map. This is the first map that I fell in love with. But what should it look like, this being Anishinaabe? First, there should be some different labels on it. Not a cartographer, so this is as good as it gets, folks. But how can I honor my ancestors with this? How can I honor my family? With work like this, with Chris. This is a map that folks who are visiting Algonquin Park get when they go to Erewhon Pines, a resort in Algonquin Park that my non-Indigenous side of my family actually helped to build. And with Chris and working with him, the point was, let's stop talking about it and let's start doing it. How do we make space for Indigenous voices and understandings? If you're not Indigenous, collaborate with us, be a good ally, and really bring us in. Chris and I worked very hard to create proper labels to make sure we were inclusive of whose territory you're on, but really highlighting the importance of those watersheds and the ways that the rivers flow. We're also celebrating that historic aspect of the park as well. This map is, I'm only showing 3 of 4 maps. Each one shows different seasons, but you can also see the ways that the trees change depending on the season that you're in. And so in closing, this is a start. We're learning, we're pushing against that common colonial practice and the way that maps have been used. Create maps with us, create maps with Indigenous peoples, include Indigenous understandings of territories, include Indigenous voices, allow us space to honor our ancestors as well as our future generations, all of our future generations. Let maps be a place where we can care for each other, where we can practice kindness, honesty, respect, and truth. Chimigwich, thank you so much. Seeing as how I talk for a long time, I'm a very long-winded person. Is there still time for questions? Time for questions? Someone give me a thumbs up. Thumbs up? All right, does anyone have any questions? At the back right there.
Fraser Taylor changed my perspective on this. When we think about geonames, the Indigenous people in Canada don't have a written language. Some of them don't. And so how do you capture the place names? And Fraser's worked with a team of people on the Indigenous place names in a spoken word, a spoken language. And it transformed our concept. So I think as a cartographer, I had a bias that they would be printed on a map, or it would be in a digital database, or it would be shown on a map. And I think that we have to, this type of work and the important work that you're doing of reflecting the Indigenous people's perspective on cartography challenged me.
Absolutely, and I will say one of the biggest questions that we have with native land, and in all transparency, me coming here and being able to say whose territory we're on, so with native land, that is the most common request that we get. How do you say these nation names? But for me coming here, I was texting with a friend from one of the tribes in what's now known as California, and saying, how do I make sure I say these nation names properly so that I can appropriately respect them and honor them? So absolutely, it is an incredible point. So what tools can also be held in partnership with those maps? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for such an amazing talk. I was wondering if you can think off the top of your head some quick tips for everyone in the interest of actionable cartography, how people can really help support Indigenous mapping, like you said, and collaborating. How should people consider going about that, whether they're in academic institutions or private spaces or large companies and organizations like the space that we sit in today?
Working with Indigenous communities, and quite often it's never the case of saying, okay, here's what I'm giving you, here's what I have that's already created here, now you can use it, but instead having that approach of, what do you need from us? How can we support you? And that could include, I think one of the most important elements is you need to have patience. You need to work with the timelines that Indigenous communities need to have, because we've got a million other things on the go every single minute, especially at a time when we are working to kind of reconnect and revitalize our existence following, the last 150 plus years. So have patience with us, but approach us in that true partnership and true collaboration, but certainly have patience with us. Let us take the lead. Yeah.
I have a question about some of the work you and your colleagues have done at native lands. Because the lines on the map that you ultimately generate are not clean, or whatever that means, right? Could you give us insight into maybe how those conversations happen, with your community collaborators, when, say, ancestral lands have overlapped, or there's been interaction between groups that are still distinct clans or what have you?
So there's no distinct point in time for the territories and the shapes of the territories. So that's kind of the first point. That's why there's also no printed version of the map, but rather a PDF that you can print on your own. But then two, having those non-defined lines and those lines that overlap, that's incredibly deliberate because we have this fluidity. For example, my territory borders Alyssa's territory, Haudenosaunee territory, and we have agreements that far supersede the arrival of settlers to this land. We honor those connections because we know we've got shared territory and we've had those agreements in place since time immemorial to share those lands. And so we'll kind of start off with a shape. And if that shape's not correct, we will work with communities to maybe change things a little bit, same way that we would change labels and so on. So really there's a starting point, but then also a collaborative process to make it as correct as possible. Anyone else?
I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about.
Can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now? Oh.
Yep.
So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the challenges that you encounter when you collaborate with cartographers. I've been working with Aboriginal people in Australia, and patience definitely is one important point. So that implies that outsiders or people you work with are often impatient. Are there other aspects that you find difficult with working with cartographers?
Yes, but I won't get into the dirty details of it. I love that you're nodding your head so much. It's amazing. So, I mean, there are all these intricacies, right, of how do you appropriately represent land and who do you listen to, right, when you're talking about a particular place, right? Because you might have conflicting claims to land, which is so often the case. Do your best to work with both communities. It's not your role to decide it's your land or it's your land, because keep in mind that history of colonial cartographies and how damaging that's been. Find a way to change that trajectory so that it is completely inclusive. And don't be afraid to change things. I think that was one of the most beautiful things about working with native land is like, and being okay that we're not right 100% of the time. We know that we can always improve and we can always continue to learn. Anyone else? All right, hearing none, Chimigwich, thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you,